Hello and welcome to this month's photo review. I'm Kate Junker, I'm an underwater photographer and writer, and I'm absolutely passionate about helping you take really great underwater photos. So without further ado, let's get on to today's pictures. This photo was taken with a TG6, the aperture was f13, the ISO was 400 and the shutter speed was 1/250. The lighting was 2 Inon Z330 strobes. And the person who took the photo said to me, "I wish I'd got closer and focused on the face and rhinophores more. The strobes were distracting me." Now this is the first time that they'd used strobes, so they were still getting used to the settings and the positioning of their strobes. And I'm having a look at the picture, and yes, I can see that there is a little bit of overexposure on the right hand side, and that could have easily been fixed by just moving the strobe up a little bit or turning it down. And if it was still a little bit too bright, pulling the strobe a little bit further away from this distracting marine life that is overexposed. The next thing, I love the diagonals of the nudibranch, how it's leaning into the frame. And you can see that there's a lot of movement in that picture. It's either moving across the foliage or it's on its way to eat a little bit of a bite there. I can see its oral tentacles are extended, so it might be having a little bit of a taste to see what's in front of it. I love that. I love the motion. I think one of the things that could be improved is the rhinophore on the right is in focus, but the rhinophore on the left is out of focus. I love the detail in the rhinophore on the right, but we actually really want to have that in both rhinophores. Now, the best way to do that is to have your nudibranch head on to you and have both rhinophores parallel to your camera. That way you can focus on both of them and get them both nice and sharp in your picture. Otherwise, I think it's a lovely picture. It is difficult to sometimes get the right angle, especially if there's rocks and boulders and marine life in the way. You always need to remember that your marine life is far more important than a photo ever will be. So always be careful how you're taking your pictures, that you don't disturb any marine life. So good shot. Look forward to seeing more. Keep on sending them in. Thanks. This photo of the nudibranch was taken with an Olympus TG6 and the lighting was a CNC YS-D3 strobe. The settings were f18, 1/250 and ISO 400. I'm not quite sure whether the photographer was aiming just to highlight the gills. They're very nice and focused, but one of the problems that the person said they had was they felt that they should have got closer, and I completely agree. In underwater photography, we always say get close and then get closer. And as this picture was taken with an Olympus TG, you've got the microscope mode. You can get really, really close. So if I was you, if next time I come across a nudibranch like this, get as close as you can and just focus on the beautiful gill rosette and make sure that that is sharp, and that can be the focus of your picture. We can't always get to the front of our subjects, and this is a good opportunity to make the most of what you've got in front of you. One of the other things that I noticed was strobe positioning. You say you have a YS-D3. I'm not sure if you have one or if you have two, but to me it looks like you've got one that is positioned to the left of your housing. It's lighting up the reef on this side, and it's also lighting the back part of the reef behind your nudibranch. Definitely get closer, focus on those gill rosettes, strobe positioning on the top of your housing, and you should have a beautiful picture. What you can also do, if you don't want to light up the reef behind your nudibranch, is to turn your strobe inwards, so the outer edge of your strobe is just lighting the nudibranch, but it's not lighting the reef behind. I know one of the things you said that bothered you was the backscatter. The problem is you've got a lot of water behind your subject, and there are always particles, there's always sediment in the water. Even the cleanest water, you will find sediments, and they are reflecting your strobe back at your camera, and that's what's causing backscatter. So yes, a little bit of Lightroom or Photoshop can help remove those. It really wasn't bad at all. This photo was taken with a TG6. The lighting was a video light. The aperture was f4.3. The shutter speed was 1/640 and the ISO was 100. There's beautiful contrast between the purple nudibranch and the background. It's got nice action. The nudibranch is eating. The rhinophores are nice and sharp. The color is beautiful. The detail is there. But I think you could have improved this picture by composing it slightly differently. In macro, there's something called negative space, and negative space is something that's not adding to your picture. So in this picture, there is a lot of negative space around the nudibranch, but it's slightly unbalanced. There's a little bit too much negative space to the left-hand side of the nudibranch, and if you just composed your shot a little bit better, you would have been able to balance it a little bit more. I like to see a little bit more negative space in front of the nudibranch rather than behind it. You could have cropped it differently too. I've given you some examples which I'll show next of how you can crop it to make the nudibranch the star of the show by cropping out all that negative space, which is something that you can definitely look at doing. Or you can have a little bit of negative space but balance it out better. One of the other things I did notice, and it's probably because you're using a TG, whereas I've got a big screen to look at the pictures on, is I've seen that there's quite a lot of post-processing in the image. So it's something to be careful about. Otherwise it's a beautiful picture. I think you've done a really good job. Perfect lighting, really nice focus on those rhinophores. I would just be a little bit more careful about composition or cropping and how photoshopped or how light-roomed the photo is in post-production. This photo was taken with a 5D Mark IV with a 100mm macro lens, ISO 800, f10 and 1/200th of a second. 2 Inon Z240 strobes were used, and the photographer used a focus light, and I absolutely love this subject. I've never seen one of these before, but I just love the textures, the smoothness of it, and then the pointiness of it, and I also love the fact that it's laying eggs. So the settings that you use are quite interesting to me. You don't need to use such a high ISO when you're using strobes. In fact, you really want to use the lowest ISO possible, which is about ISO 100 in your case. Also, if you have a look at the eggs, they're pretty much soft. They're not as detailed and as sharp as they could be if you were using a higher aperture. So in your case, you're using f10. You should really be looking at using f18 to f25 because that will give you a much better depth of field with the lens that you're using. So look at using a higher aperture to get better depth of field and much crisper image. And then your shutter speed of 1/200 is absolutely fine. You can go faster. You can go up to 1/250, and that will give you more of a black background. Overall, I think it's a very interesting, beautiful picture. Composition wise, what I would do is I would also, rather than the odd crop that you've used, it's not quite 1:1, I would use landscape. Now I've cropped it into a landscape and I'm going to show you what that looks like. But what that does is that's actually taking out that bit of reef at the bottom, the rock that nudibranch is sitting on. It removes it and it's giving you less negative space. It's making the viewer's eye look more at the nudibranch rather than being distracted by the rock that it's sitting on. So have a look at your composition too. It would really make a difference. Crop it a little bit more if you can, or compose it better by going closer if possible. I know your working distance of the 100mm macro lens is quite big. You can add a weaker diopter of about +5 or +7 just to give you less working space. But otherwise, it's a beautiful image.